Hello, my dear friends. In the Middle Ages, men could go without a bath all winter, pluck their beards by hand, and use ashes to shave their cracked heels. Sounds horrifying, but that's just the tip of the iceberg of ancient male personal hygiene. There were no toothbrushes, no soaps, no concept of smelling good, and no shame about stinking. How they dealt with sweat, lice, scabies, and unspeakable corners will both nauseate and intrigue you. Tonight, let's quietly follow the unwashed footsteps of medieval men. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever wonder how often medieval men cleaned themselves, the answer usually depended on what they did for a living. A blacksmith didn't wash the same way a monk did. A farm worker didn't bother with the same habits as a nobleman's scribe. For most men, hygiene wasn't a set of steps they followed each morning. It was something that happened when it made sense, or when it couldn't be avoided anymore. The job they worked shaped how they smelled, what they touched, and how often they reached for water. Most men didn't have a daily routine. There were no schedules for washing faces or trimming hair. A farmer might wake up before sunrise, put on the same clothes he wore yesterday, and head straight out to the fields. He might splash some cold water on his face if the bucket wasn't frozen. That was enough. His hands would get dirty again within minutes. His sweat would soak into his shirt by mid-morning. Washing before work felt pointless, and often it was. Blacksmiths worked in heavy heat all day. Ash clung to their arms, and smoke stuck to their skin. Some wore leather aprons to protect their clothes, but nothing kept the grime off completely. At the end of a long day, they might rinse their hands or face with cold water from a trough. That was it. They didn't scrub themselves clean. They didn't expect to. If you asked a smith about hygiene, he might just blink at you and keep hammering. There's something almost funny about how a man could spend 2 hours polishing a sword but not 5 minutes on his armpits. Soldiers had their own way. When they weren't fighting, they might wash their hands and faces if they had access to a well or a river. But during marches or battles, cleanliness dropped far down the list of concerns. Armour didn't mix well with soap. They sweat underneath layers of wool and metal, and often went days without removing anything but their helmet. Some used sand or grass to rub dirt from their skin. A few carried cloths or even herbs like mint to mask the smell, but that was rare. Lice were common, so were fleas. Bathing happened when the weather was warm and the location was safe. Then there were the monks. Their lives were different. Monasteries often had designated areas for washing hands, especially before meals or prayers. Water flowed through stone channels, and everyone lined up for a quick rinse. It wasn't luxurious, but it was more regular. Monks weren't spotless, but they followed rules. Washing was part of their routine, tied to their duties. They used rough linen towels and cool water. There was no soap unless the monastery made it themselves. No one expected to feel fresh. It was more about discipline than comfort. Men who worked in noble households had better chances. Servants who worked near lords or nobles were expected to stay relatively clean. They may be given access to warm water, clean towels, and occasionally assistance from other staff members. Faces were wiped before meals, and hands were cleaned before handling objects. These men weren't cleaner by nature, they just had the resources, and the expectations were higher. You couldn't serve wine with mud on your hands. You couldn't stand near a nobleman if you smelled like a horse stable. Tradesmen fell somewhere in between. A baker might rinse his hands several times a day to keep the dough clean, but not his face or hair. A carpenter brushed off sawdust and sweat, but rarely bothered with a thorough wash. A tanner who worked with animal hides often smelled so bad that washing hardly helped. He might rinse the worst parts and move on. Most of the time, their tools were better cared for than their bodies. Modern hygiene checklists would have made them laugh, or maybe just confused them. There were no mirrors in most homes, no combs unless you made one from wood, No shelves with bottles or jars. Most men had a bowl, a cloth, and perhaps a blade to trim their beards. If they shaved, it was with cold water and a dull knife. If they washed, it was quick and rough. Skin got scratched. Cuts were common. Warm water was a luxury. In winter, it was avoided. Washing in freezing air wasn't brave. It was stupid. You'd get sick. So most men didn't risk it. I find it strangely admirable how they managed with so little and didn't complain. No one told them to be cleaner. Neighbours didn't gossip about body odour. Everyone smelled. That's just how it was. Cleanliness wasn't a moral duty. It wasn't tied to pride or shame. If a man looked dirty, it usually meant he worked hard. If he smelled, it meant he'd been sweating for a reason. Dirt was normal. Scratches were expected. So were rashes, blisters, and stiff clothes. That was life. They didn't question it. This link between job and hygiene created different standards. A scribe might rinse his hands more often because he didn't want ink on the scrolls. A gravedigger might only wash when he got home and noticed the smell. A merchant might keep his face tidy to look more respectable in town. But even then, the differences were practical, not cultural. No one thought deeply about cleanliness. They thought about the weather, about illness, and about finishing the task ahead. At night, there wasn't a bathroom to step into, no toothbrush, no shower. A man might wipe his face with the same cloth he used for the table. He might lie down without changing his clothes. The same socks, the same shirt. Blankets rarely got washed. And if he was tired, he didn't care. He'd sleep, wake up, and do it all again. Today, not showering for 3 days is a punchline. Back then, it was just Tuesday. That was the rhythm of their days, not by choice, by structure. Work decided everything. Hygiene wasn't skipped because they were lazy. It was skipped because they didn't have time, or tools, or even the idea that it mattered. They cleaned when it got too bad, when their hands were sticky, when their faces burned, when someone else asked them to, not before. That's how it started. Men washed when their work let them, not before and not for appearance, and that made perfect sense to them. In the next part, we'll look at the rare times they actually chose to bathe and why they never did it just to smell nice. While most hygiene during the day came from necessity, full bathing was something else entirely. It wasn't something men did at regular intervals, or because they wanted to feel refreshed. Bathing in medieval times wasn't routine, and it certainly wasn't about smelling nice. For most men, a proper bath only happened when there was a good reason. That reason usually had little to do with comfort and more to do with discomfort, like skin disease, visible rashes, or an upcoming religious obligation. There were moments when a man couldn't ignore the itch on his arms or the red patches spreading on his legs. Ghastly boils, infected scratches, or clusters of lice were strong motivators. In those cases, washing the body became more like treatment than relaxation. The same went for preparing to attend a holy day or celebration. If someone planned to enter a church, visit a shrine, or take part in a procession, they were expected to at least look like they made an effort. Washing for God's sake carried more weight than washing for one's own. Of course, where and how a man bathed depended heavily on where he lived. In villages and farms, natural water sources were used. A stream nearby, an unused well, or even collected rainwater could do the job. There were no tubs for soaking. A man might strip down to the waist, pour water from a wooden bucket, and scrub with his hands. Sometimes he used a cloth if he had one, or a bunch of wet leaves. That was enough. It wasn't about feeling clean. It was about removing the visible layer of dirt. Compared to today's scented baths and bath bombs, their idea of bathing was more like rinsing a shovel. In warmer months, some men took the chance to wade into rivers. Bathing in moving water helped carry dirt away. It also gave some relief in the summer heat, but they didn't linger. No one spent an hour floating and thinking about life. It was quick. Step in, bend down, scrub, step out. And not everyone liked to do it in front of others. In rural areas, privacy didn't exist. but modesty still mattered to some degree. Men often chose early mornings or quiet hours when fewer people were around. In winter, bathing became a challenge. Most men avoided it altogether. The water was too cold, the air colder still. Stripping down in the open air meant risking illness. Some tried to heat water in pots over the fire, but that required time, effort, and firewood they might not want to waste. Instead of a full wash, many settled for wiping their bodies with a damp cloth or using vinegar or old beer as a cleaning agent. The smell might be strong, but it was considered preferable to sweat. Soap, when available, wasn't the kind we think of today. It was made from animal fat and ashes, harsh on skin and sometimes gritty. Poorer men didn't have it at all. Instead, they used things they could find. Sand to scrape, crushed herbs, or even rough cloths. Leaves like sage or nettle were sometimes rubbed on the skin to ease itching. Others turned to ashes from the hearth, mixing it with water to make a thick paste. It helped remove grease but left a smoky smell behind. There's something oddly efficient about using the same fire to cook dinner and clean your armpits. Men didn't keep track of how long it had been since their last bath. They didn't mark it on a calendar or plan it for the weekend. It happened when it needed to happen. Maybe their wife insisted, maybe their boss did, or maybe the itching was too much to bear. Some men bathed only a few times a year, others more often, depending on their job or their access to water. But even those who bathed monthly were considered unusually clean. Bathhouses existed, mostly in towns, but not everyone went to them. Some were public, shared spaces where men could pay for access to hot water and steam. Others were more like inns with separate tubs and attendants. But they cost money, and rumours often surrounded these places. People whispered about immoral behaviour behind closed curtains. By the late medieval period, many bathhouses were frowned upon. Some were shut down. That left most men with simple options: bucket, river, or not at all. In cities, access to water was easier, but that didn't guarantee cleaner habits. The water wasn't always fresh, and carrying it up several flights of stairs wasn't easy. Some men simply paid others to fetch it or used leftover cooking water to rinse themselves. It wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough. Cleanliness wasn't about being spotless. It was about removing enough dirt to avoid shame or infection. I've always found it fascinating how they could live with that level of discomfort and still function as if it were normal. After bathing, there was rarely a towel. Most men dried off with an old cloth or let themselves air dry. Clothes went back on, whether they were clean or not. Often, the same outfit worn before the bath was worn again after. They might brush it off, beat it against a wall, or shake out dust. Washing clothes was a separate task, done less frequently than bathing. Wet bodies went into dry shirts, and that was that. There wasn't much aftercare, no lotion, no deodorant, no grooming rituals. If a man shaved, he might do it then, but many didn't. If his skin stung, he'd rub a little animal fat or vinegar over the spot. Otherwise, life moved on. There was always something else to do. Animals to feed, tools to sharpen. A bath was just one more thing that took time, and time wasn't something they wasted. These days, we shower to feel better. Back then, they bathed so they didn't feel worse. And so, for most medieval men, bathing wasn't about starting fresh. It was about scraping off enough dirt to be able to think about something else. Their bodies stayed tough. Their habits stayed simple. They didn't wash to impress. They washed to keep going. Coming up next, we'll look at where they did all this. The rivers, the corners, and the places men used when there was no bath in sight. Even though bathing was rare for many medieval men, there were still places where it happened more often, especially when the weather allowed and the location made it easy. Most of these places weren't private, and none were luxurious. The simplest and most common option was nature itself. Rivers, lakes, and shallow streams became bathing spots as soon as the days grew warmer. There weren't walls or curtains, there weren't soap dishes or towels, just water and a few rocks to sit on, if you were lucky. In villages where a river ran nearby, groups of men often bathed together. They didn't go out to swim for pleasure, and they didn't stay in long. It was more like a fast rinse than anything else. Someone might walk into the shallows, crouch down, splash water over his chest, rub his face and neck, then walk right back out. There was no sequence or system. The goal wasn't to feel clean, only to look a little less dirty. Some washed off mud after farm work. Others rinsed before walking into town or attending a church service. It wasn't always comfortable. The stones could be sharp, the water could be cold, and the air wasn't always still, but it was free, and that made it worth it. Men used the same spot where animals drank or where clothes were washed. No one seemed to mind. Privacy wasn't expected. Bathing was quick. It was common to see a man half naked in the morning light, splashing water over his body, while others waited nearby, chatting or standing with their arms crossed. It's strange to think that what would now get you arrested for public indecency was once just part of a quiet Thursday morning. Of course, not everyone bathed this way. In cities and larger towns, communal bathhouses existed, though not everyone trusted them. For men who lived close by and could afford the fee, these bathhouses offered something closer to a proper wash. Large stone tubs were filled with hot water heated by fire. Men sat together in the same pool or shared smaller tubs lined along a room. Steam rose from the water and voices echoed off the walls. There wasn't much furniture. There were benches, a few hooks for clothing, and usually one window to let in some light. These bathhouses didn't offer privacy. There were no curtains to pull closed, no partitions between tubs. A man sat beside another man, often shoulder to shoulder. They washed quickly. They didn't linger unless they had something to discuss. In some places, bathhouses were only open to men during certain hours of the day, while other times were reserved for women. This separation wasn't always enforced, and there were stories of confusion or deliberate bending of the rules, especially when money changed hands behind closed doors. Still, for those who used them as intended, bathhouses were functional. They didn't smell of herbs or perfumes. The water wasn't replaced after each person. And you couldn't bring your own soap unless you were wealthy enough to have some. Most men just rinsed with water and rubbed with a coarse cloth. A few paid attendants to scrub their backs. Others did it themselves using a wooden paddle or handfuls of straw. Once clean, they dried off with whatever fabric they had brought. If not, they stood near the fire until their skin was no longer dripping. In many towns, bathhouses weren't just places to wash. They were social centres. Men talked about trade, news, or local gossip. Some discussed deals or made arrangements for work. Others sat silently, trying to enjoy the heat before stepping back into the chill outside. For some, it was the warmest moment of the week. Compared to modern gyms with showers and saunas, these places were closer to smoky caves where people whispered and hoped no one noticed the fleas. Not everyone liked using them. Rumours spread quickly. Some bathhouses were thought to attract crime or immoral activity. Others were closed down by religious leaders who feared that too much relaxation might lead to temptation. In certain towns, public notices were posted near bathhouses to remind users to behave. But for working men, those warnings didn't matter much. They didn't come for pleasure. They came to rinse off sweat and return to work. In the countryside, men didn't have these choices. Rivers were the only option. They bathed in the same spot where cattle crossed or women fetched water. Some wrapped cloths around their waists. Others didn't bother. It depended on the community. In a few villages, elders enforced quiet customs about when and where men should bathe, often choosing early evening after labour had ended. In winter, river bathing stopped. Men wiped themselves down indoors using water heated over the hearth. If they had time, I think there was something honest in how public it all was, even if awkward. Everyone knew the river was for everyone. Some communities had rules about shared spaces. A few churches posted signs about modesty, especially near bridges where people bathed downstream. There were even fines in some regions for bathing too close to women's washing areas. Towns that had more structured laws assigned separate hours or days for men and women to use public baths or streams. But the reality was, people worked around each other. A man might bathe before dawn to avoid a crowd. Another might wait until sunset. Quiet routines formed without anyone needing to say much. There weren't places for rest or pampering. Bathing wasn't about soaking in peace. It was about removing mud, sweat, and the layer of labour from your skin. Once done, men dressed quickly, often back into the same clothes, and went home to sleep or eat. The warmth faded fast, the water dried faster, and by morning they would be dirty again. Today, we put effort into creating spa-like experiences. Back then, they just wanted to avoid scaring the neighbours, so whether it was a muddy riverbank or a smoky bathhouse, men found ways to clean themselves when they could. It wasn't about being seen or admired, it was about getting back to normal, just for a moment. In the next part, we'll look at how they dealt with body odour and why nobody seemed too bothered by the smell of hard work. For all the effort medieval men put into washing when they could, there was one part of hygiene that rarely seemed to bother them. Body odour wasn't a problem to solve, it was a part of life. Sweat didn't carry shame, it carried meaning. A man who smelled strongly was often seen as someone who worked hard, moved often, or fought bravely. The smell wasn't always pleasant, but it was familiar, and for many, it was almost expected. Men who laboured in the fields or workshops didn't think twice about their scent. A farmer coming in from the fields would have dust on his boots, hay in his sleeves, and sweat dried along his neck. A blacksmith might smell like iron and smoke, with sweat clinging to his collar. That was normal. No one winced. No one stepped away. In a room full of working men, no one stood out for smelling like they had just worked. The idea of masking body odour with fragrance was not a common practice for most of them. Soldiers had their own way of thinking about it. On long marches or after battle, they smelled like blood, dirt, and leather. That wasn't a weakness. That was part of their presence. Some even believed that a strong body smell could intimidate enemies. A man who hadn't bathed in weeks, with a hardened look and a heavy scent, gave the impression of someone who didn't fear pain. It's a strange kind of strategy, but cheaper than armour and harder to wash off. There were no deodorants, no perfumes unless you were wealthy. Even then, scents were for special occasions. A man didn't dab himself with oil before heading to chop wood. He didn't rub herbs under his arms before pulling on a tunic. The scent of labour was proof that labour had been done. If anything, trying to hide it might have made others suspicious. People trusted a man whose shirt smelled like hay and smoke more than one who smelled like mint. Living close to animals made it even harder to care about scent. Men who worked with cattle, pigs, or horses were surrounded by smells all day. After a while, the scent became part of them. It settled into their clothes, their skin, even their hair. They didn't try to fight it. They accepted it. Only men who worked directly with nobility, or inside religious houses, made more effort. That wasn't about personal pride, it was about expectation. You couldn't serve a nobleman's meal if you smelled stronger than the stew. In monasteries, monks kept to cleaner habits, but even there, body odour wasn't a cause for alarm. They washed when rules required it. They changed clothes when supplies allowed, but the focus was on humility, not freshness. Smelling too clean might have been seen as vanity. Among themselves, monks didn't comment on odour. Their concern was spiritual, not physical. They lived in close quarters, ate simply, and accepted whatever scent the day brought. In towns and cities, where people lived closer together, the situation wasn't much different. Public spaces were full of smells. Markets carried the scent of animals, fish, sweat, and dust. Homes didn't have proper ventilation. People cooked inside, sometimes slept near the hearth, and shared beds with family or servants. The idea of having a personal scent that was distinct or offensive didn't really hold up. Everyone smelled. That was just part of the day. Compared to today's obsession with smelling like flowers or soap, Their world must have seemed like one long, sweaty handshake. Scent didn't define social standing unless it was extremely bad. If someone truly stank, it might be a sign of illness or neglect. But normal body odour wasn't judged. It was understood. You couldn't haul sacks of grain without sweating. You couldn't walk 10 miles in leather shoes without leaving a trail of salt on your back. Bathing helped, but it wasn't magic. The smell came back quickly. And no one had the tools or time to prevent that. Some men did small things to manage it. They might carry a pouch of herbs near their belt or rub scented vinegar on their wrists. But that was rare. These efforts were more common among those who worked near nobles or among merchants who wanted to seem more refined. Even then, it was limited. A few drops of rose water didn't mask the smell of 2 days on horseback. Clothes absorbed a lot. Shirts weren't washed daily. Often, they weren't washed for weeks. A man might wear the same tunic for days, letting it air out near the fire at night, then pulling it back on in the morning. The fabric held sweat, smoke, grease, and everything in between. That became his scent. His clothes told the story of his work before he even opened his mouth. To be honest, I find it oddly logical. If everyone smells the same, no one needs to worry about it. There was also a different relationship with space. People didn't stand as far apart. They didn't have personal bubbles. Families slept in the same room. Neighbours leaned close to speak. A certain level of smell was part of being alive. Men didn't expect to be judged for it, unless their job demanded something else. The blacksmith was supposed to smell like fire. The fisherman was supposed to smell like salt. The priest might smell like incense. Each man carried a scent that fit what he did. And the truth is, they didn't mind. Or if they did, they didn't say much. Complaining about smell wasn't common. There were bigger problems. Hunger, cold, work. The scent of sweat wasn't worth discussing. If someone did try to cover it up, it was usually for a wedding, a court appearance, or a special feast. Otherwise, the scent stayed. It wasn't attractive or repulsive. It was just there. Today, we wash away our scent to feel presentable. Back then, they wore theirs like part of their skin. That's how body odour lived among them. Not hidden, not treated, just accepted. For medieval men, scent wasn't something to fix. It was something to carry, and unless they stood in a noble's hall or a bishop's corridor, no one asked them to smell like anything other than themselves. Next, we'll turn to something. After scent came appearance, and one of the most noticeable things about a medieval man was the state of his hair and beard. Unlike bathing or washing, which could depend on water or time, grooming your hair was something most men could do, even with simple tools. A knife could cut, a comb could shape, and how a man chose to deal with his hair often said something about who he was, where he belonged, or what rules he followed. Among the upper classes, grooming was tied closely to status. Knights, noblemen, and men who served at court were usually expected to keep their facial hair trimmed and neat. Some preferred clean-shaven faces, while others wore small beards, carefully shaped. Hair was kept at a moderate length, brushed back, or tied. Having a tidy appearance was part of showing discipline, control, and readiness. A man who looked after his face was seen as someone who looked after his role. It didn't mean they had luxury, but they had standards. In many noble households, there were even barbers on hand. These men didn't only cut hair, they also pulled teeth, treated wounds, and trimmed beards. A nobleman might sit once a week to have his hair maintained, not because it was dirty, but because it needed to stay proper. Messy hair sent the wrong message. Today, a fancy haircut might get you likes on social media. Back then, it got you a seat closer to the fire. Monks followed a different rule entirely. Their hair wasn't about style or class, it was about obedience. Most orders required them to shave a bald spot at the crown of the head, known as a tonsure. This mark of humility reminded them, and everyone else, that they had given up worldly appearances. The rest of the hair was trimmed short, usually by another monk. The style was never meant to flatter, it was a signal of devotion. No beard shaping, no styling, just simple hair, cut for a purpose. Tuition about these customs often started early. Boys who were set to enter monasteries had their hair cut accordingly. Those destined for knighthood might be guided into grooming habits that matched noble expectations. The connection between hair and status was easy to see. In paintings, noblemen are drawn with defined hairlines, shaped beards, and smooth skin. Peasants, on the other hand, are shown with long, tangled hair and thick beards, not because they didn't care, because they didn't have the reason or means to care. For common men, especially those in rural areas, hair grew freely. Long hair wasn't unusual. Some tied it back with a cloth, others let it fall loose. It was only trimmed when it got in the way, or when life gave them a reason. One such reason was mourning, when a family member died, or when a man passed from one phase of life to another. It wasn't uncommon to cut hair as a gesture. These moments didn't follow fashion. They followed emotion, tradition, or religious feeling. Facial hair followed a similar line. Most working men had beards, either by choice or by circumstance. They might shave once a month, or only when visiting relatives. Some carried small knives that they used to scrape hair from their cheeks or neck, but it wasn't a daily task. Soap was rare. Mirrors were almost non-existent. You did what you could with what you had. A clean shave took time and often left small cuts. Many didn't think it was worth it. There's something oddly comforting about knowing that a crooked hairline didn't ruin anyone's morning. Barbers weren't common in villages. If someone needed a trim, they asked a friend or family member. Children often had their hair cut by their mothers using kitchen shears or knives. The result was uneven, but practical. And that was the goal. Hair wasn't for show. It was something that got dirty, caught bugs, or tangled in tools. Keeping it manageable mattered more than keeping it fashionable. In some regions, hair also held meaning. A man with a shaved head might be marked as a criminal or slave. Others wore their hair long to show tribal or cultural identity. These signals varied depending on the area and the period, but the principle stayed the same. Hair was a marker. It told people where you stood, what you did, or what had happened to you. Among soldiers, grooming was a mix of necessity and habit. Long hair could be pulled or tangled during combat. Beards could become itchy under helmets. Many soldiers trimmed for comfort, not looks. In some armies, regulations were introduced that required short hair for discipline. In others, commanders didn't care. As long as you held your weapon and didn't fall behind, no one minded how you looked. I've always thought there was something very human about the way hair reflected what people valued. Not just beauty, but identity. Haircuts were rare events, sometimes linked to milestones. A first battle, a marriage, a new job. Men might shave their heads before joining a monastery or after surviving an illness. Hair was something that could be changed without money. That gave it power, in places where clothes stayed the same for years and meals barely changed. Cutting your hair was one of the few ways to feel like something had shifted. Keeping clean wasn't always possible, but keeping hair under control was more manageable. Even without soap or hot water, a man could wash his head in cold water, scrape away lice, and feel a little more ready for the day. Some used ashes or sand to rub their scalp. Others used oil or fat to smooth down unruly strands. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked well enough. Today, we talk about hairstyles as statements. For them, it was just one more thing to keep out of their eyes. So whether a man wore his hair in layers or just let it grow wild, whether he shaved every week or not at all, his choice, or lack of choice, said something. Not loudly, not for attention, but in quiet, daily ways. In the next part, we'll follow the men who didn't always have a choice. The ones who marched, slept on dirt, and tried to stay clean with nothing but a pouch of herbs and a strip of cloth. Outside the stable world of villages and towns, a different kind of life took shape. Soldiers, messengers, mercenaries, and travellers often spent days or weeks away from home. Whether they marched with an army, rode between cities, or guarded a border post. the idea of comfort faded quickly. No basins were waiting at the end of the day, no clean towels are folded nearby, and certainly no privacy. Keeping the body in decent shape during long campaigns wasn't about looking good. It was about not falling apart before the next fight. Medieval soldiers knew how quickly grime could build up. Sweat collected under the armour, dust clung to skin, insects nested in clothing. A man could feel fine in the morning and find rashes on his thighs by nightfall. When they had water, they used it sparingly. A few splashes on the face, a rinse for the hands, or a quick wipe behind the neck. That helped, but it never lasted long. Water wasn't always clean either, especially near crowded camps. Streams carried waste, wells went dry. Rain came too late or not at all. To cope, some soldiers carried small pouches of herbs. Dried sage, mint, or rosemary could be crushed and rubbed on the skin. This helped mask the odour a little and made them feel less like they were rotting. Some men soaked strips of cloth in vinegar before leaving home, hoping to reuse them along the way. Others stuffed herb bundles into their boots or packed them into the folds of their tunics. It didn't solve much, but it gave a moment of relief. There's something both clever and slightly tragic about scrubbing your armpits with weeds while praying not to die in battle. When water ran out, they used what they could find. Dry grass, crumpled leaves, or rough cloths were all fair options. A handful of ashes from a cooking fire could be rubbed into the skin and brushed off, pulling away sweat and grease. Some used sand in the same way. It scratched, but it worked. Dirt removed dirt. That was the logic. No one expected to feel clean. The goal was to stop itching, to scrape off the layer of discomfort before it turned into something worse. Skin problems were constant. Under layers of wool and leather, heat built up fast in hot weather. Men sweated until their clothes clung to them. In cold weather, they sweated and then froze in place. Hiding moisture under tight armour created the perfect home for rashes and infections. Foot rot spread quickly, especially when boots stayed wet. Red patches appeared on legs and arms. Blisters opened. Scabs bled through fabric. If you couldn't move well, you became a liability. So even rough cleaning mattered. Sleeping conditions made things worse. Soldiers didn't carry tents unless they were high-ranking. Most lay on the ground or under simple shelters. Rain, wind, and bugs were part of the night. If they found dry straw, it was a blessing. If they had to lie in mud, they did. Clothes stayed on. Boots weren't removed unless necessary. Many slept in their gear. In the morning, they stood up sore and damp, then marched again. There was no space to change, no moment to dry off. Compared to today's soldiers with gear bags, hydration packs, and field wipes, these men lived more like animals than fighters. Even so, they had their tricks. Some wore linen undergarments beneath their armour to absorb sweat. These could be rinsed quickly and dried over a branch. Others lined their boots with straw or moss to keep their feet drier. When they had time, they aired their shirts by tying them to the side of a tent or laying them on a rock in the sun. The smell never left, but it eased for a while. Sharing these habits wasn't shameful. It was practical. One man's trick could save another's skin. Injuries complicated everything. A cut that might have healed in a clean bed could become infected in a camp. Soldiers carried simple balms or pastes, often made of grease and herbs. They rubbed them on sores or burns. If they had nothing else, they used animal fat or even mud. Bandages came from torn shirts or spare cloth. Boiling water was rare. Sterilization wasn't a known concept, but they learned what worked. Covering wounds mattered. Keeping flies away mattered. And sometimes, the man who washed his feet at dusk walked better than the one who didn't. I've always thought it took a quiet kind of discipline to keep yourself together when no one's watching and everything stinks. Smell was part of life on campaign. Soldiers smelled like horses, oil, blood, and each other. They didn't complain unless something changed. A man smelling worse than usual might be sick. A man who refused to wash at all might be avoiding attention. Body odour was loud in the heat. It clung to blankets and cloaks. But in a group of 50 or 500, no one had room to judge. Smell faded into the background, like hunger or pain. It became normal. The only times they cleaned more thoroughly were before ceremonies, inspections, or entering churches. Then they shaved if they could, rinsed what they could reach, and tried to look decent. These were rare moments. Most of the time, they stayed focused on staying alive. Hygiene was a tool, not a goal. You kept your body from falling apart so you could keep marching. Nothing more. There were, of course, those who didn't care. They let their sores bleed, their feet crack, their faces stay caked in grime, and they paid for it. Infection spread fast. Weakness grew quietly. You could survive a sword wound and die from a rash. The men who made it home often weren't the strongest. They were the ones who stopped to clean their boots when others didn't. Today, we pack travel kits for weekend trips. Back then, a strip of cloth and a sprig of mint were considered lucky. That's how medieval men kept themselves going during long stretches away from home. They didn't expect comfort. They didn't count on supplies. They used what they had and did what they could. Some found routines in the mess. Others just endured. In the next part, we'll move to the mouth, where dental care was even less frequent and much more painful. Not everything about the body was visible from the outside. Some parts stayed hidden until they caused real trouble. One of the most neglected areas for medieval men was their mouths. Teeth weren't something people paid much attention to unless they started to rot, ache, or fall out. Oral hygiene, if it could be called that, was a low priority. A man could live with blackened molars or broken incisors for years without doing anything about them. Pain was the only thing that ever changed that. Most men didn't brush their teeth. The idea of brushing daily with bristles and toothpaste simply didn't exist. A few might chew on a stick or rub their teeth with a cloth. But that wasn't common. If someone had access to clean water, he might rinse his mouth out in the morning. More often, they used something stronger. Biting herbs, drinking watered-down wine, or swishing around warm beer helped loosen the residue and reduce the smell. That was the extent of regular care. It wasn't enough. Teeth turned brown or black over time. Bacteria built up along the gums. Cavities formed without anyone knowing. Some men developed tooth pain gradually, while others woke up one day unable to chew. They didn't have dentists in any modern sense. If a man needed help, he went to whoever had the right tool and a steady grip. That person might be a barber, a blacksmith, or someone at the market known for pulling teeth. The process wasn't gentle. A pair of pliers or heavy tongs was used to yank the tooth straight out. There were no numbing agents, no proper seats, no careful explanations. The man sat, braced himself, and held tight. If he was lucky, it came out in one piece. If not, part of the tooth stayed behind and caused infection. It's amazing how many people made it through life with fewer teeth and a lot more grit. For most men, the loss of a tooth didn't change anything. They chewed more slowly, avoided hard crusts, or favoured stews over bread. Tooth pain was common, and no one expected to have a perfect set of white teeth. If you smiled and showed broken molars or missing corners, no one thought less of you. It meant you had eaten what was given, survived illness, and likely kept working through the pain. There were homemade remedies. Saltwater rinses helped soothe inflammation. Some chewed cloves or mint to dull the ache. Others packed ashes into the hollow space or bit down on leather strips. These weren't cures. There were ways to get through the day. Sometimes the pain faded for a while. Other times, it worsened until swelling spread across the jaw. In rare cases, the infection led to fever and even death. But that was seen as unfortunate, not preventable. Compared to today's routine dental visits and fluoride treatments, their version of care was more like damage control than prevention. Men didn't worry about breath. No one expected a clean smell. Mouth odour was normal. It mixed with everything else. Beer, onions, meat, and smoke created a strong blend that surrounded most conversations. People didn't flinch from it because they all shared it. You didn't stand out for smelling bad, you stood out if you somehow didn't. Even when men reached old age with few teeth left, they got by. They chewed slowly, swallowed soft food, and relied on habit. There were no dentures, no replacements. A man who lived to 50 with half his teeth was considered fortunate. If his teeth were still strong enough to bite into bread, he was doing well. Most didn't get to keep all of them. Some attention was paid to religious days or rituals. Before certain feasts or ceremonies, men might rinse their mouths more thoroughly. That wasn't about dental care, it was about purity and preparation. A man entering a church might chew fresh herbs to freshen his breath, not for beauty, but for respect. These habits were exceptions, not the rule. In wealthier circles, there was a bit more effort. Nobles sometimes had better access to herbs or cleaner water. They might use toothpicks carved from wood or bone. A few had powdered mixtures of salt and herbs to rub on their gums, but even they weren't free from decay. Fancy spices didn't stop rot. Toothaches made no distinction between ranks. Everyone had to eat, everyone had to chew, and everyone, at some point, had to endure the pain. I think what surprises me most is how they accepted tooth loss the same way they accepted bad weather or sore feet. It just happened. There was also no shame in complaining once it started to hurt. A man who moaned about his leg might be called lazy, but a man clutching his jaw and unable to eat was met with silence. People understood. They had felt it. They had watched others go through it. Sometimes it made men short-tempered. Sometimes it made them quiet. The worst part was waiting. Waiting for it to go away or get bad enough to do something about it. Tooth pulling was often done in public. At fairs or market stalls, a man might sit on a stool while someone pried his tooth out in front of a crowd. Blood on the ground, groaning through gritted teeth, and a final crack were all part of the scene. People watched. Some winced, others clapped. Pain was part of the show, and if the man stood up afterward and walked away, he was seen as brave. There wasn't much healing. A cloth was pressed to stop the bleeding, maybe a sip of wine to dull the sting. Then back to work, back to walking, back to chewing on the other side. No one brought soup to bed. No one stayed home for a sore mouth. It was just another part of being alive. You lost teeth the same way you lost time. Slowly. Then all at once. Today. We rush to fix the smallest chip. Back then, they spit out the broken piece and moved on. And that's how men lived with their teeth. They didn't brush, polish, or protect them. They just hoped they lasted. And when they didn't, they endured the pain or paid someone to end it. Next, we'll turn our attention to where all that chewing ended up. The places they relieved themselves, and how little privacy they had to offer. Painful teeth and poor hygiene weren't the only discomforts men accepted. Just as common, and sometimes even more awkward, was the lack of private space. In a medieval world where homes were small, buildings were shared, and rooms served multiple purposes, the idea of doing anything alone was unusual. Privacy, at least in the way we understand it today, didn't exist for most men. Whether you needed to wash, relieve yourself, or simply have a quiet moment, chances were high that someone else was nearby. Most villages didn't have indoor toilets. Instead, people relied on simple pits dug outside the house, known as latrines. For those who lived in towns, there were public facilities, though facility might be too generous a word. These were small wooden structures placed near rivers or streams, built over holes that were only sometimes emptied. They were used by many and cleaned by few. The smell was constant. So was the presence of flies. If you needed to go, you went. There wasn't much thinking beyond that. In rural areas, men often chose the edge of the garden or the back of a field. Some used designated spots. Others just looked for a quiet corner. A few carried small shovels to bury waste, but that was more about courtesy than regulation. There was no toilet paper, no water taps, no sinks. Leaves, moss, cloth scraps, or even a handful of dirt did the job. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't comfortable, but it worked, and it didn't shock anyone. Inside the home, personal washing was kept simple. Men didn't clean themselves in the bedroom. There were no basins built into furniture, no running water behind a door. A jug of cold water sat near the door, maybe a small wooden bowl beside it. That was it. If a man wanted to wash his hands or face, he knelt beside the bucket or carried it outside. Washing inside, especially in sleeping areas, was rare. There were concerns about spills, smells, and mess. Dirt was supposed to stay out. Compared to today's bathroom tiles and scented soaps, they had more patience than porcelain. Those who travelled or lived without a permanent shelter had even fewer options. Soldiers in the field relieved themselves behind trees or among bushes. Traders on the road found spots off the trail. Men who slept in barns or camped outside washed with dew, drank from streams, and cleaned themselves as best they could with rags. They adapted, but they never expected comfort. A strip of cloth, a bucket of water, and a patch of ground were all they hoped for. Inside towns, some homes had chamber pots. These were small ceramic or wooden bowls used at night or during bad weather. They were stored under beds or behind curtains. In the morning, someone emptied them into a trench, a pit, or over the wall. The smell lingered. That was normal. If you shared a room with 3 other men, you learned not to complain. Noise and smell were part of sleeping indoors. I sometimes think medieval men had stronger noses and weaker boundaries than we do today. Privacy, when it existed, was based more on silence than walls. People looked away, or they simply acted like they didn't notice. If a man needed to bathe behind a house, others gave him a few moments. If someone crouched in the woods, no one stared. Modesty didn't come from space. It came from habit. Everyone knew the rules, even if they were not written down. You didn't talk too much. You didn't look too long, and you didn't expect to be alone. Men who lived in monasteries or served in royal households had slightly more structure. Bathing schedules were written out. Latrines were cleaned more often. Washing happened at certain times and in certain places, but even there, you weren't alone. Monks bathed in groups. Servants used shared wash basins. The idea of a personal space with a locked door came much later. In most cases, men grew up knowing their body was never hidden from the world around them. This shaped how they thought about themselves. Hygiene was practical, not private. A man cleaned what he could when he could. He didn't wait for quiet. He didn't wait for the right room. He found a spot, did what needed doing, and moved on, and no one judged him for that. They were doing the same thing. A few places offered more organised spaces. Castles had garderobes, which were vertical shafts built into the wall, leading to a pit below. Men used them by sitting on a wooden board, letting gravity do the rest. The smell drifted down and out, though not always successfully. Garderobes were shared, cleaned rarely, and used by everyone from servants to knights. Still, they were a step up from open fields. Markets and festivals posed their own problems. Hundreds of people crowded into small areas. With few latrines and no running water, men relieved themselves wherever they could, behind tents. Along fences, even beside food stalls. It was common to see someone step away from a conversation, return a few minutes later, and continue eating like nothing happened. There were no signs, no schedules, and no shame. It's hard to imagine now, but sharing a field with 10 strangers was once considered normal bathroom behaviour. Even washing hands wasn't consistent. Some men rinsed after meals if water was near. Others didn't. Shared bowls might be passed around. A cloth hung on a nail served as a towel for 5 or 6 men. There was no soap unless someone had brought it from home. Dirt stayed on fingers. Grime clung to nails. That didn't stop anyone from eating with their hands or wiping their mouths with their sleeves. That was how privacy worked, or didn't work, for men in medieval life. There was always someone nearby, always a noise in the next room, always a pair of eyes not quite looking but not gone either. Cleanliness, like everything else, was done openly, quietly, quickly, and then forgotten. Today, we lock doors and play music to drown out the sound. Back then, they just waited for the wind to blow in the right direction. Next, we'll take a closer look at what they didn't hide either. Their skin, cracked, burned, sun-darkened, and rarely softened. It told a story all its own. Not much about medieval men's lives was soft. Their beds were rough, their shoes were stiff, and their days were long. So it wasn't surprising that their skin reflected the same pattern. There was no routine to protect it, no products to soften it, no reason to worry unless it broke or bled. Skin, like muscle or bone, was just something that had to keep working. If it cracked or burned, you kept going. If it peeled or blistered, you waited, and if it scarred, you barely noticed. Most men spent hours outside, whether in the sun, the wind, or cold. Their skin took whatever the weather gave. Faces turned red from heat, then brown from exposure. Hands dried out from working soil, carrying tools, or gripping reins. Lips split open in winter, cheeks peeled in summer. They didn't call it damage, they called it life. A man with soft skin probably hadn't done enough. A man with calloused fingers and a leathery neck looked like someone who pulled his weight. They didn't use lotion. There wasn't any. And even if there had been, few would have used it. Some had access to animal fat, and that was the closest thing to a moisturiser. It was rubbed into cracked hands or sore feet, not because it smelled good, because it sealed the skin for a little while. Others used lard or leftover grease from cooking. It wasn't refined, but it worked when needed. Today, we pay extra for hand cream that smells like lavender. They use leftovers from dinner. In the fields, exposure happened daily. Farmers bent in the sun, their backs slowly darkening until the skin stayed red even in shade. Shepherds spent days under open skies, their faces dry and marked by wind. Fishermen's cheeks stayed raw from salt and rain. They didn't cover up. Hats and gloves were a luxury. Most had hoods or simple cloth wraps, but those didn't block much, so the skin suffered. No one talked about it. Cracks appeared often, around knuckles, on heels, behind knees. The skin split and stung. Dirt slipped in. Infection wasn't far behind. Still, few stopped to treat it. A rag was tied around the worst parts, or nothing was done at all. Pain was part of the job. You didn't ask if it hurt, you just kept moving. There's something almost funny about how they accepted bleeding hands the way we accept Monday mornings. Burns were common, especially for blacksmiths, cooks, and anyone working near open flame. A glowing coal could leave a scar in seconds, so could a pot tipped the wrong way. These marks stayed. No one tried to hide them. A burn on the wrist or a scald on the forearm told people what you did. It didn't make you less. It made you experienced. Men who fought in battles carried deeper marks. Sword cuts, arrow scrapes, blows from clubs. Even if the wound healed, the skin rarely went back to how it was. Scars ran across chests, arms, and faces. They weren't polished or smoothed. They were rough and uneven, but they were respected. A man with a scar had survived. He was dangerous, or at least lucky. That was enough. I've always found it honest. The way scars weren't something to hide or erase. They were part of the map. For those who could read, there were a few books that mentioned ointments, recipes made from herbs, oils, and beeswax. But these were used rarely and often saved for the sick or the wealthy. A wounded noble might have someone apply balm to his skin. A monk might mix salves for a sick brother. But a farmhand or a foot soldier, they had no such luxury. Their treatment was time and luck. In winter, the cold bit harder. Skin dried and cracked faster. Fingers bled more often. Lips turned dark. Some tried to warm their hands over fires, but the heat only lasted so long. Others rubbed snow on their skin, hoping to numb the sting. Fat and wax were used when available, but not everyone had those. Many just bore the pain. It passed, or it didn't. Either way, they got up the next day and did it all again. Men didn't comment on each other's skin unless something was wrong. A rash might mean disease. A boil could signal something worse. But dryness peeling cuts. That was normal. No one asked. No one offered anything. It was part of the job. It was part of being outside, being strong, being needed. Compared to today's skincare routines with 10 steps and special towels, they made do with cracked palms and a bit of tallow. Even when they got older, most men didn't change habits. Wrinkles came early, skin grew thin, spots darkened, but the approach stayed the same. It wasn't about staying young or looking fresh. It was about keeping skin from splitting too far. And if it did, wrapping it up and moving on, the rest could wait. They didn't seek perfection. They didn't look in mirrors often enough to worry. What mattered was whether they could grip a tool, lift a stone, or carry a load without flinching. If the skin broke, they'd deal with it later. Maybe with cloth, maybe with grease, maybe with nothing at all, and that was enough. Today, we check for smoothness. Back then, they checked for blisters. Next, we'll move from the skin to the clothes they wore over it. Not the fine fabrics of royalty, but the layers of cloth that soaked sweat, held dirt, and rarely saw a proper wash. After the skin, the next layer was cloth. What a man wore said something about where he belonged, how hard he worked, and how often he had a chance to change. Clothes weren't just something to wear, they were a second skin. For many medieval men, the same shirt stayed on for days, sometimes weeks, until it was too dirty to ignore or until someone told them to put on something better. Most men had few pieces of clothing: a shirt, a tunic, some trousers, maybe a cloak. These were made from rough materials like wool or coarse linen, and they weren't comfortable by modern standards. But they were strong. They had to be. They were worn again and again. During planting season, a man might rise in the same tunic he'd worn all week, brush off yesterday's dust and go back to the field. At night, the shirt came off to dry near the fire, then back on in the morning. Washing clothes took effort. You needed water, time, and soap, which was often homemade and rough on fabric. A river helped, but not everyone lived near one. A well was better, but most were used for drinking and cooking first. Only families with extra help or private space could afford to wash clothes often. That made clean garments special. You didn't waste a wash day on something that could go another 2 days. Compared to today's standards, where a shirt might be considered dirty after a few hours, they would have found us impossibly fragile. Big events were the exception. Weddings, feasts, or visits from important guests meant a change of clothes. That didn't always mean putting on something new. It meant putting on the cleaner one, the one with fewer patches, fewer stains. Sometimes it meant borrowing from a brother or neighbour. Sometimes it meant scrubbing the current outfit in cold water the night before. Whatever could be done to look more presentable, they did. But not for themselves, for the moment, for the occasion, for respect. In the military, things were stricter. Soldiers didn't own much, but they were issued a clean undergarment whenever they returned to a stronghold or garrison. That shirt might have been worn by another man the week before, but it had been rinsed, and that made it fresh enough. Outer clothes weren't always changed, but having a clean layer beneath made a difference. It helped with smell, with heat, and with morale. Travellers had an even harder time. A man walking from one town to another might wear the same clothes the entire trip. He'd sleep in them, eat in them, sweat in them. Rain would rinse them. Dust would cling to them. When he arrived, he brushed them off, shook out the folds, and hoped for the best. Changing clothes was a luxury for people with luggage and servants. Most had neither. I think there's something honest in how they wore their clothes until the clothes stopped helping. Among nobles, Wardrobes were larger, but even they didn't change as often as people assume. A nobleman might have several tunics, cloaks, and shirts, but the work of washing and mending was constant. Clean clothes are needed for staff, they needed supplies, so even in castles, clothes were worn more than once. Scented sachets were sewn into collars. Linen was placed between skin and fabric to protect outer garments. Layers weren't just for warmth. They helped keep the top layer looking clean. Servants had fewer choices. Many wore a uniform of sorts, or whatever was given. If it got dirty, they waited until wash day or used a rag to wipe off the worst of it. Men working in kitchens or stables are expected to smell like their job. No one asked them to change unless a superior was visiting. Then, they found a cleaner apron or borrowed a better coat. It was part of keeping order, not pride. For those in the countryside, washing clothes meant finding a stream or using shared tubs. Women often handled the washing, scrubbing garments against wooden boards or rocks. Soap was made from ashes and fat, strong enough to clean but rough on hands. Clothes were beaten, wrung out, and hung on hedges or lines. Men waited until their clothes were dry before they wore them again, which could take a full day or more. Because of this, clothes often had a smell, a mix of sweat, smoke, and earth. But no one commented. It was part of daily life. If someone smelled unusually clean, it usually meant they had come from church or a noble's house. Otherwise, everyone carried the scent of what they did. Farm clothes smelled like soil. Blacksmiths smelled like iron. Shepherds smelled like wool and grass. It's almost funny to think how today we change clothes to match the weather, while they changed only when the moment demanded respect. Patches and repairs were common. Men didn't throw away torn shirts. They stitched them. Holes were covered with new fabric, often in a different colour. Knees were reinforced. Sleeves were extended. Clothes changed shape over time. A man's shirt might begin its life in church and end in the field. When it finally wore through, it became a rag. Nothing was wasted. Children wore hand-me-downs from older siblings or neighbours. A tunic could pass through 3 or 4 bodies before it was done. Sizes didn't always match, but fabric was expensive, and time was short. Boys often wore tunics that were too large, then grew into them. Girls shortened their skirts as they wore out. Mending was constant. Changing wasn't. Men sometimes brushed off dust before going into town. They might shake out their sleeves, clean their shoes with a wet cloth, or wipe their hands before entering a house. But these gestures were quick. There was no mirror, no second opinion. You looked presentable if no one looked twice. That was enough. Today, we hang our clothes in closets and plan outfits. Back then, they folded what they had and made it work. That's how clothes lived on men's backs, day in, day out. They weren't fresh, but they were familiar. They weren't new, but they were useful. And when the time came to change, it wasn't a habit. It was an event. Next, we'll look at how men handled those long stretches away from home, where even owning spare clothes was considered lucky. Clothes that stayed on too long and water that was hard to find made travel even more difficult. For men who lived much of their lives on the road, or followed armies across unfamiliar ground, hygiene became a quiet struggle. These were not men who stayed near a hearth or had someone boil water for them. They slept under trees, beside fences, or wherever the sun dropped. They did not expect comfort. They expected dirt, cold air, and days without washing. When a man had to travel far, he packed light. There was no space for extra clothing or fancy tools. A small cloth to wipe his hands, a pouch of herbs, maybe a flask of weak wine. If he had a knife, he might use it to shave occasionally. If he did not, his beard grew. If he had a second shirt, he was lucky. Most had only one. And once they left home, that shirt stayed on until they came back, or until it gave out. Water was precious, and it was not always clean. Travellers used it to drink first. Whatever remained might be used to rinse the face or clean a cut. But even then, many hesitated. Rivers near towns carried waste. puddles grew cloudy with animals nearby. Wells were sometimes guarded or dry. In those moments, hygiene had to adjust. Compared to modern travellers with hand sanitizer and toiletry bags, these men made do with whatever did not move or sting. When a man could not wash with water, he reached for what he could find. Dry grass, pieces of linen, or even soft bark were used to wipe sweat and dirt from the skin. Some rubbed themselves with sand to remove grease or the sticky grime of travel. Others pressed leaves to their faces to clean away dust. It was not much, but it made the skin feel less tight, less sore, and that was enough to keep going. Rubbing down the body became part of setting up camp. Before lying on the ground or leaning against a rock, a man might sit and clean his arms, chest, and feet, not for beauty, but to prevent sores. A rash on the leg or a cut on the heel could turn dangerous quickly. Infection was common, especially in places where men slept too close and shared food, tools, and clothing. That made small acts of cleaning more valuable than they seemed. For wounds, there were not many options. Most travellers carried something strong to pour over a cut. Weak wine, sour beer, or vinegar helped wash out dirt. It stung. It always stung. But it worked, at least for a while. If something looked bad, red streaks, heat, swelling, then rest became the only solution. Some tied cloths around wounds, others chewed herbs or pressed them directly into the skin. These were not cures, there were delays. I've always thought it took more courage to keep walking with a wound than to swing a sword in battle. The smell followed them. After 3 or 4 days on the road, a man could feel the layer of grime build. His clothes absorbed every breath, every drop of sweat, every meal. He noticed it less over time. But when he passed someone on the road or entered a tavern, the difference became clear. People turned, some stepped back, others looked away. It was not shameful, it was expected. Travellers smelled like travel. No one questioned it. Some men carried sprigs of rosemary or thyme, tied to their belts or tucked into the folds of their cloaks. They did not wear these for show. The scent helped mask the worst parts of themselves. It made standing in line or sharing a bench easier. It did not make them smell good, just less bad. Others rubbed their hands with crushed herbs or poured a bit of wine on a rag to wipe their neck. The sting helped them feel clean for a moment. When rain came, it was both a curse and a blessing. It soaked clothes and turned roads into mud. But it also rinsed the skin and gave men a chance to wash without wasting their own water. Some stood with their arms out, letting the sky do what wells could not. Others stripped down if no one was near. For those who spent weeks between places, a cold rain was better than nothing. Rest stops were rare. When they came, the first task was not to sleep. It was care, drying boots, scraping off dirt, checking for cuts, cleaning hands and face. If a fire could be made, some boiled water to rinse their feet. If not, they wiped themselves with a cloth, shook out their shirt, and leaned back against a wall. That was their reward. Not warmth, just the absence of discomfort. Today, even a short hike ends with a hot shower. For them, walking for weeks meant praying your socks did not rot into your skin. Inside inns or stables, hygiene was better but still limited. Travellers could pay for a basin of warm water or a brush for their boots. Some used communal tubs, others refused. Privacy was rare, water was shared, towels were thin, but it was better than nothing. For a few coins, a man could feel human again, if only for an evening. Still, most did not complain. The ache of feet, the weight of grime, the sting of a bad scrape, these were facts, no problems. The men who travelled long distances learned to live with discomfort. They cleaned what they could, when they could. They waited for rain, they rinsed with wine, and when there was nothing, they wiped their face with their sleeve and kept walking. I think there is something admirable in how they kept their dignity, even when they could not keep clean. And so, the road left its mark, not just on boots or shoulders, but on skin, breath, and clothing. Men did not come home smelling fresh. They came home still standing, and in the end, that was enough. Next.